There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over the Kansas plains after sundown in early March. A quiet so complete it has weight pressing down on everything beneath it. The flat earth, the frozen creek beds, the dark silhouettes of cattle standing motionless in the cold. It is not peaceful quiet. It is the quiet of a place that does not care whether you are there or not, that would look exactly the same if you packed your wagon tomorrow and drove east until the land softened into something gentler. Ezra Colt had lived inside that quiet for 4 years. He had stopped fighting it somewhere around the second winter. By the fourth, he had started to believe it was enough. He was sitting at this table when he wrote the letter. One oil lamp burning low, casting more shadow than light across the single room of the cabin he had built with his own hands 11 years before, when he was 25, and still had the kind of energy that doesn't ask whether something is reasonable before it starts. The table was solid. The floor was real planked wood, not packed dirt, which was more than most men in Dickinson County could say. The cook stove in the corner had never failed him. These were the things Ezra Colt counted when he needed to remember that his life amounted to something. He read the letter back to himself once before he folded it. His handwriting was not elegant, a working man's script, each letter formed with the deliberate pressure of someone who learned penmanship late and never quite trusted it. The letter described his acreage. 38 acres south of Dry Willow Creek, good grazing land, a well that ran 40 feet deep and had never gone dry even in the drought summers of the early 70s. It described the cattle, 23 head decent stock, one bull with bloodlines he'd paid a fair price for out of a rocking H auction near Salina. It described the cabin, the smokehouse, the root cellar dug into the north-facing slope where the ground stayed cool through July. It was by the objective measure of what a man in Dickinson County in 1878 could reasonably offer a good letter. A respectable letter. The kind of letter that should have required no further elaboration. At the bottom, in handwriting that had slowed down from the rest, as though the hand itself was considering whether to continue, he had written 4 words that no matrimonial registry in the state of Missouri had ever received before or would likely receive again. Plain-looking preferred, homely acceptable, ugly welcome. He read those 4 words 3 times. The lamp flickered once in a draft from the north wall, the one that needed rechinked before real cold came. He folded the letter, creased it flat with his thumb, and slid it into the envelope he had already addressed to the Frontier Matrimonial Registry, St. Louis, Missouri, care of one Mrs. Harriet Boone, proprietress. He was not joking. That was the thing a person needed to understand about Ezra Colt. He was 36 years old, rangy the way a fence post is rangy, not thin exactly, but all function, nothing wasted, with sun-cracked skin across the back of his neck and forearms that told the story of 14 years of Kansas weather without a single word. He was not a man who made jokes in the dark at his own kitchen table. He was a man who had arrived the way you arrive at a fence line you've been walking toward for a long time without knowing it was there at a conclusion. The conclusion was this: pretty was a liability he could no longer afford. He blew out the lamp. In the dark, the quiet pressed down harder, and Ezra Colt lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling of his own making, and thought with the flat certainty of a man who has thought something through until all the emotion has been wrung out of it, that he had made the right decision. He thought about Lillian Hayes for exactly as long as he allowed himself to think about Lillian Hayes, which was not long. Long enough to remember the spring of 1874, when he was 32 and she was 29, and she had looked at him across the Abilene church social the way a woman looks at a man when she has decided he is worth the looking. He had been at 32 a man with prospects. The 38 acres were already his, paid for and clear of debt. The cabin stood. The cattle numbered 15 head and were improving. He was not rich. No one within 40 miles of Dry Willow Creek was rich in any meaningful sense. But he was solid. He was the kind of solid that a person could build a life against the way you build a wall against the wind. Lillian Hayes had smiled at him for 6 months. He had taken her to 2 church socials, 1 county fair, 1 Sunday supper at the Greer family's place out on the ridge. He had told her about the land, about the plans he had for the south pasture, about the second barn he meant to build before the decade was out. He had not been a demonstrative man. He was not built for demonstration, but he had been present and attentive and honest, and he had believed with the particular confidence of a man who does not extend himself lightly that those qualities were worth something. In November of 1874, at the First Methodist Church of Abilene, at a potluck supper held to raise funds for the new schoolhouse roof, Lillian Hayes had stood beside a man named Douglas Farwell, who owned 72 acres east of town, a frame house with actual window glass in every room, and the easy, expensive kind of confidence that comes from never having had to count anything. And she had laughed at something Douglas Farwell said, and then she had turned to the small cluster of women near the pie table, and she had said something that Ezra Colt heard from 8 feet away, because the room had gone briefly quiet, in the way rooms do, when someone near them says something the speaker doesn't intend to carry. Dry Willow Creek is far enough from town to be inconvenient and close enough to smell it in a wet spring. The women had laughed the small, polite laughter of people who are not being unkind, but have not yet decided to be kind either. Douglas Farwell had smiled the way men smile when a woman says something that reflects well on his alternatives. Ezra Colt set down his plate. He walked to where his coat hung by the door. He put it on without hurrying, said goodnight to Reverend Silas Greer, who was nearest the exit, and walked out into the November dark. He drove home 8 miles to Dry Willow Creek and did not speak to anyone about it, not the next day, not the next month, not in the 4 years between that November night and the March evening when he wrote his letter to Mrs. Harriet Boone. He did not hate Lillian Hayes. He had thought carefully about whether he did in the long prairie dark hours of several subsequent winters, and concluded that hate required a kind of sustained energy he was not willing to spend. What he felt was something more architectural. She had shown him a structural weakness in his own planning. He had built the 38 acres against the Kansas wind. He had not thought to build anything against the particular damage of being publicly found insufficient. The weakness was his, not hers. He simply meant to address it. The solution arrived at across 4 winters of flatland thinking was elegant in the way that solutions seem elegant. When you have arrived at them alone, a woman with no better options would not be doing arithmetic. A woman who looked at 38 acres on Dry Willow Creek and saw a good life rather than a consolation prize, that woman would not be standing beside a Douglas Farwell someday, deciding whether the smell of the creek in a wet spring was worth the inconvenience of a window with actual glass. The arithmetic only worked, he had decided, if the woman had no other numbers to run. He sealed the envelope the next morning. He drove it to town himself rather than wait for the post-rider. He dropped it through the slot at the Abilene post office, heard it land in the collection box below, and drove back to Dry Willow Creek with the particular satisfaction of a man who has executed the first step of a plan he is completely certain about. It was without question the most flawed reasoning in Dickinson County. He would not discover this for several more months. Mrs. Harriet Boone had operated the Frontier Matrimonial Registry out of a narrow office on Chestnut Street in St. Louis for 11 years. In that time, she had read letters from men describing acreage in every territory west of the Mississippi, cattle counts from Kansas to Montana, timber claims in Oregon, silver shares in Colorado, all of it offered as evidence of fitness for marriage, the way a merchant offers inventory as evidence of business health. She had learned to read between the descriptions for the actual man, the one who wrote good water when he meant, I have been lonely for 6 years, the one who listed comfortable dwelling when he meant, please don't let me spend another winter talking to the cattle. Ezra Colt's letter was the only letter in 11 years of operation that had made her set it down and pick it up again. She read the final line 3 times. Then she sat back in her chair and looked out at Chestnut Street for a moment, at the St. Louis traffic of horses and wagons, and the occasional new electric streetcar that still surprised her every time it passed, and she thought about what kind of man wrote that line, and more importantly, what kind of woman she might legitimately send to him. She did not have an ugly woman on her books. She had plain women, practical women, a widow from Springfield who described herself as no great beauty but an excellent manager, and one woman from Cincinnati whose enclosed photograph suggested a confidence in self-description that bordered on creative writing. What she had at the precise moment Ezra Colt's letter arrived in her office was a file she had been uncertain what to do with for 3 weeks. The file belonged to a woman named Mabel Ashford, 30 years old, of Independence, Missouri, who had written to the registry in February describing herself in terms so systematically unflattering that Mrs. Boone had read the letter twice, trying to determine whether the woman was deeply humble or deeply strategic. Mabel's letter said she was unremarkable in face, sturdy in frame, plain as a Sunday sermon, and unlikely to improve upon further acquaintance. It said she could cook, preserve, sew, mend, manage a household budget, assist with livestock if required, and had once helped her father reset a broken fence post in frozen ground, offered not as a boast, but as evidence of practical character rather than decorative one. The letter did not mention auburn hair the color of a Missouri October, the kind of red-brown that catches light without trying. It did not mention cheekbones that a portrait painter in St. Louis had once unprompted, and to Mabel's considerable irritation described as architecturally significant. It did not mention eyes the precise shade of new creek growth in May the green that is more idea than color, direct enough to stop a conversation from across a room without the eyes themselves doing anything deliberate. Mrs. Boone knew what Mabel Ashford looked like because Mabel had enclosed a photograph as the registry required, and the photograph had given Mrs. Boone a brief private crisis of professional ethics. Matching this woman to most of the letters on her books would be, she suspected, a disservice to the woman. Most of those men would spend the first year looking at the face, and the next 5 years confused about why the face wasn't enough. Ezra Colt's letter changed the calculation entirely. Mrs. Boone read it a fourth time, then pulled Mabel Ashford's file set, the two documents side by side on her desk, looked at them for several minutes, and wrote two letters. One to Ezra Colt in Abilene, Kansas, confirming that she had a candidate who appeared to match his stated requirements, and one to Mabel Ashford in Independence, Missouri, enclosing a copy of Mr. Colt's letter and asking if she might be interested in correspondence. What Mrs. Boone did not include in either letter, because some things a matchmaker keeps in the service of the match, was the information that Ezra Colt's inquiry was not his first contact with the registry. 2 years earlier, in 1876, she had forwarded his initial letter to two women on her books, women who were by any measure plain and practical, and exactly what his letter described. Both had written back declining. One had said he seemed adequately situated but without evident ambition. The other had said nothing specific, only that she had decided to pursue other arrangements. Ezra Colt did not know that he had been declined twice by women he had been told were his most likely match. He thought 1878 was his first attempt. In a sense, the letter with its stark, defiant final line was itself a piece of evidence, not of desperation, but of a man who had decided that if his real requirements were considered unreasonable, he would simply stop pretending they were something else. Mrs. Boone recognized that quality. She had been in the business long enough to know it was rarer than acreage. She sent both letters on a Tuesday. She gave the matter no further worry after that. Some matches she could see from the beginning. This one she could see from the end. Mabel Ashford read Ezra Colt's letter on a Thursday evening in late February, sitting at the small table in the back room of her cousin's house in Independence, where she had been staying since October, when the last of her father's estate had been settled and the house on Maple Street had been sold to pay what remained of the debts. She read the letter the way she read everything, carefully without hurry, her finger tracing nothing but her eyes, moving at the pace of thought rather than the pace of words. She read it once through. Then she set it down on the table beside the lamp and looked at it for a moment, the way you look at something you hadn't expected. Then she laughed. It was not a polite laugh, not the kind she had been producing for 6 months at the appropriate intervals in social situations that required it. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere below conscious decision, that catches a person slightly off guard. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Her cousin's cat, who had been sleeping on the windowsill, opened one eye. Mabel Ashford had not laughed like that since the previous August. She knew the date precisely because August was when she had last permitted herself the luxury of finding anything genuinely funny, before the sequence of events that had arranged themselves with the bleak efficiency of a hard winter. Her father's death in late July, the discovery of the debts in August, the dissolution of the engagement in September. The engagement had been to a man named Roland Prentice, whose family ran a dry goods concern in Kansas City, and who had, over the 14 months of their understanding, seemed to Mabel a man of reliable character and genuine warmth. She had not been wrong about the warmth. She had been wrong, or rather unprepared, about what the warmth was attached to. When the house on Maple Street went to the creditors and the Ashford name ceased to represent anything bankable, Roland Prentice had come to call on a Thursday afternoon and had told her, with the kind of careful, regretful honesty that is somehow worse than dishonesty, that his family felt the match was no longer suitable given the circumstances. He had said it with genuine sorrow. That was the part that had stayed with Mabel, not the abandonment itself. She had been abandoned before in smaller ways, by smaller men, but the sorrow. He had genuinely wished things were otherwise. He had also, she understood in the weeks that followed, genuinely loved something about her that was connected to the Ashford house on Maple Street. and the social weight that came with it. And when those things were gone, what remained? The actual Mabel, the one who read agricultural pamphlets for enjoyment and could reset fence posts in frozen ground, had not been enough to override his family's arithmetic. She had understood in the months since that Roland Prentice was not a villain. He was simply a man who had looked at her and seen a version of her that she was not, and had decided he wanted that version rather than the actual one. The problem was not unique to Roland Prentice. It was, in Mabel Ashford's experience, a nearly universal condition among men who encountered her, because the thing they saw first, the face, the hair, the direct green eyes that stopped conversations, was always the wrong thing to see first. It was an accident of arrangement, nothing more, no more meaningful than the fact that she was left-handed or had a scar on her right thumb from a canning accident at 14. It was not her. It was simply what happened to be visible when a person looked in her direction. She had written to Mrs. Boone's registry in February with something close to scientific precision. She had described herself in terms that were accurate in the ways that mattered: practical, capable, plain-spoken, uninterested in pretense, and had omitted the things that were not relevant to the actual question of whether she would make a good partner for a man building a life on the frontier. The omission was not deception, it was prioritization. She had decided that the first man who responded to her actual qualities, rather than to her face, would be a man worth considering. Ezra Colt had not asked about her face. He had specifically in writing asked for something else entirely. Mabel read his letter a second time more slowly, attending to what was underneath the words. The man who had thought carefully about what he needed, who had been precise about it to the point of appearing ridiculous, who had asked not for beauty's absence because he despised beauty, but because he was afraid of something specific, and had named the fear clumsily in the only language available to him. She thought about this for a long time. The cat went back to sleep. Then she pulled out a sheet of paper and wrote her reply the same evening. She wrote about the fence post in frozen ground. She wrote about her familiarity with the Prairie Homesteaders companion, which she had read twice and considered reliable on most subjects, except drainage, about which it was optimistic to the point of fiction. She wrote about her cooking, her preserving her ability to manage a household on a budget that left room for neither waste nor sentimentality. At the end, she wrote one sentence that she did not explain. I believe I am exactly what you are looking for. I look forward to disappointing you. She folded it, sealed it, and walked it to the post office herself the next morning before she could reconsider. She did not reconsider. Ezra Colt received Mrs. Boone's initial reply in early March and read it twice at the kitchen table in the same chair where he had written the original letter. He read it the way he read anything that required decision, without rushing, attending to each word as a discrete piece of information. Mrs. Boone described the candidate as plain-featured, sturdy, and remarkable for practical ability rather than personal decoration. She enclosed the first letter from Mabel Ashford minus the final line, which Mrs. Boone had, in a rare editorial intervention, chosen to hold until she felt the correspondence had progressed sufficiently that it would land correctly. Ezra read Mabel Ashford's letter twice. He noted the fence post. He noted the homesteader's companion. He had a copy himself, had the same reservation about the drainage chapter. He noted the tone, which was neither deferential nor aggressive, but direct, the way a good tool is direct, designed for function rather than impression. He wrote back the same day describing the south pasture, the grazing rotation, the plan for the second barn. He asked about her experience with cattle rather than with cooking, partly because he already knew she could cook from the letter, partly because cattle were the actual question. Her reply came 12 days later. She knew about bloodlines. She knew about rocking H-stock. She had read about it in a livestock circular from Selena and had formed opinions which she stated without qualification. The opinions were reasonable. One of them was better than the opinion he had been operating with. He wrote back the same day again. By the third exchange of letters, Ezra Colt had arrived at a conclusion he had not anticipated arriving at. He was looking forward to the next letter. This was itself a piece of information he filed carefully, the way he filed information about weather patterns and soil conditions, as data relevant to planning, not as sentiment. He was not sentimental. He was a man making a practical arrangement. The fact that the arrangement was turning out to be more intellectually engaging than anticipated was simply evidence that Mrs. Boone had done her job competently. He did not reread the letters. He was not the kind of man who reread letters. He reread two of them. In the fifth letter, he proposed that she come to Abilene. He proposed March because the ground would be passable and because the spring was the time to see the land. Honestly, not the softened version of midsummer, but the actual version, the mud and the wind and the late frost that could take a stand of winter wheat if you miscalculated. He wanted her to see what she was considering without the benefit of good weather making the argument for him. He wrote that he would meet her train and drive her out to the ranch, and that she should bring what she needed for a 6-month trial, as the registry's standard terms specified, and that he would understand if she found the situation unsuitable. He sealed that letter carefully. He did not reread it. He told Harlan Duff the same week because Harlan was his nearest neighbor 3/4 of a mile east along the creek and would notice eventually, and it was better to control the information than to let Harlan reconstruct it from observation. He told him on a Tuesday morning when Harlan stopped by to return a borrowed post-hole digger, stating it plainly without preamble. I wrote to a matrimonial registry in St. Louis. Woman's coming out in March. 6-month trial standard arrangement. Harlan Duff was 41 years old, weathered to approximately the color and texture of old fence board. A widower of 7 years who had raised 2 daughters to adulthood, mostly through stubbornness and the good fortune of daughters who required less management than he feared. He stood with the post-hole digger resting against his shoulder and looked at Ezra for a long moment. Mail order, he said, the way a man says something when he is deciding not to say several other things. It's a registry, Ezra said. Reputable operation out of St. Louis. Harlan looked out at the south pasture for a moment. What did you tell them you were looking for? Ezra told him. Harlan was quiet for a longer moment than the first. You told them that. In writing. Harlan set the post-hole digger down against the fence rail and took his hat off and looked at it. He put it back on. All right, he said, and picked up the post-hole digger again. All right, then. He walked back toward his own property along the creek, and if he had opinions beyond those 2 repetitions, he kept them on his side of the fence where they belonged. This was one of the qualities Ezra valued in Harlan Duff. The train from Independence to Abilene took the better part of 2 days with a change in Kansas City. Mabel Ashford traveled with 1 trunk and a carpet bag, the trunk containing everything she owned that was worth the freight, the carpet bag containing what she would need immediate access to the Prairie Homesteaders companion. A smaller volume on livestock management she had borrowed from the Independence Lending Library and not yet returned her mother's recipe ledger, a change of clothing, and a folded copy of all 5 letters she and Ezra Colt had exchanged, which she had read once on the train out of Independence, and then put away. She did not reread them on the train. She was not uncertain about them. She was using the traveling time for something else, which was looking at Kansas through the window as the land flattened and widened and the sky took up more of the available space than the ground did, a proportion she had not encountered before. Missouri had hills enough of them to give a person the comfortable illusion that the horizon was a negotiable distance. Kansas apparently considered that illusion a form of weakness and had dispensed with it entirely. She watched the land for several hours. She noted where the soil changed color near creek beds. She watched the cattle where they grazed and where they didn't, the latter being as informative as the former, if you paid attention. She looked at the sky the way her father had taught her to look at weather, not for what it was doing now, but for what the patterns suggested it intended. She had been watching the Abilene Depot platform for 2 minutes before the train stopped through the window of the second-class car, and she had identified Ezra Colt before the train completed its braking. Not because she had a photograph she didn't. He hadn't sent one, but because there was one man on the platform holding his hat with both hands, in the way a person holds something they are not sure what to do with. Standing straight in the manner of someone who has been raised to stand straight and is now doing it more deliberately than usual. Looking at the arriving train with an expression that was not quite any single thing. He was tall, rangy, with the kind of face that weather has worked on for a long time, not old but seasoned, which is a different thing entirely. She watched him for those 2 minutes while the train slowed. She watched him shift his weight, once resettle his hat in his hands, look at the train windows, and then away. She thought, this is a man who is nervous, who has built the nervousness into something that looks like patience, because he has decided that is what a capable man looks like while waiting. She thought, this is a man who prepared something in his mind for this moment and is not sure the preparation will hold. She thought with the particular clarity that comes from watching someone who does not know they are being watched. This is a man who has been hurt in a specific way by something specific and has spent a long time building walls against a recurrence, and has just now realized here on this platform, in the time it takes a train to stop, that the walls might not be the right architecture for what's coming. She had made her decision before her foot touched the platform. She stepped down onto the Abilene Depot boards, one hand on the rail carpetbag in the other, and looked directly at him. Not searching, not hesitant. He was 12 feet away, and she walked toward him at the pace of someone completing a transaction they began some time ago. His face in the moment before he arranged it into something more neutral was not disappointed. She had expected disappointment. She had, in fact, been counting on it as the first honest data point. What she saw instead was something she had not anticipated, a brief, unguarded moment of something closer to alarm, the specific alarm of a man who has planned carefully for one outcome and is standing in front of a different one. Mr. Colt. She stopped at a conversational distance, not the closer distance of social performance, the actual distance of two people who are going to talk about something real. His jaw reset itself. Miss Ashford. He held out a hand and she shook it, which was not what most men expected her to do, but he did not appear to find it strange. You look surprised, she said. I look surprised, he agreed, which was not quite an agreement. Is there a difference? He could not in the moment construct one. She noted this without expression. She turned to survey the wagon at the rail, one solid horse, a working wagon without pretension, a clean water canteen hooked on the seatboard. Adequate. Better than adequate. Your letter said the ranch was south of town. About 8 miles. Then we should go. She moved toward the wagon with the directness of someone who has already lost time standing still. Standing here won't get the supper started. She climbed up onto the wagon seat without waiting for assistance, arranged her carpetbag between her feet, and looked at the Kansas sky with the same attending focus she had given it from the train window. Ezra Colt stood beside his horse for a moment that lasted just long enough for him to decide something what exactly he couldn't have said. Then he tied her trunk to the wagon bed, untied the horse from the rail, and climbed up beside her. The 8 miles to Dry Willow Creek were the quietest miles he had spent in adult company, and the quality of the quiet was wrong. It was wrong in the sense that it was not uncomfortable. He was accustomed to the absence of conversation. He was not accustomed to the presence of someone whose silence had the character of active attention rather than empty politeness. After approximately 4 miles, during which she had been watching the land with the steady focus of a person taking inventory, she said without turning, "How deep does your well run? 40 feet. Good water." She nodded once, the nod of someone filing a confirmation. A mile passed. That south pasture, do you rotate it or does it run cattle year-round? Year-round mostly. She made a small sound, not a criticism. The sound a person makes when they have already thought about something and have just received the information that completes the thought. He looked at her sideways. She was watching the pasture in question, which was visible from the road. He had prepared for questions about the cabin, about the distance to the nearest church, about whether the winters were truly as bad as people said. He had prepared, if required, to discuss the social situation in Abilene, the quality of the schoolhouse, the availability of the dry goods store. He had not prepared to discuss grazing rotation on the south pasture before they had cleared the first 6 miles. He was not certain what he had prepared for. When the ranch came into view, the cabin solid against the flat sky, the smokehouse, the root cellar mound, the fence lines running straight, he felt the habitual pride of a man showing work that represents years of accumulated decision. He had made sure the cabin was in order. Real floor, real roof, cook stove standing without the assistance of baling wire, the north wall as good as it was going to get before someone with time and clay could see to it properly. Mabel Ashford stepped down from the wagon before he had set the brake, fully carpetbag in hand, and walked to the cabin door. She opened it. It was unlocked. There was nothing within 40 miles worth locking a door against, and stepped inside. He tied the horse and followed. She made a full, slow turn in the center of the room. Her eyes moved to the stove, to the pantry shelf, to the single south-facing window, to the 2 chairs at the table, to the ceiling, where a previous repair was visible in the roofing boards. She went to the north wall, pressed one hand flat against the chinking, found the place where the draft came through, and pressed harder. "It's a good cabin," she said. Something in his chest released a fraction. Then, "I'll need to re-chink the north wall before real cold comes. 2 seasons of settling since the last application." She moved to the pantry shelf, ran a finger along the board, examined the construction of the bracket beneath. "This shelf needs a second tier before winter. There won't be room for preserves otherwise." Ezra Colt opened his mouth, closed it. She was already setting down her carpet bag and rolling up her sleeves with the efficient economy of someone who has already decided what comes next and is simply proceeding to it. He stood in the doorway of his own cabin and felt the disorienting sensation of a plan encountering its first real contact with an actual human being. The plan was not surviving the contact in the way he had intended. The plan had specified someone who would look at 38 acres and see a good life rather than a consolation prize. What was currently happening in the cabin he had built with his own hands was that someone was looking at his pantry shelf and seeing an engineering problem. He could not decide whether this was what he had asked for. He was fairly certain it was not what he had expected. Outside, the Kansas sky was doing the thing it did in early March, cycling through light and shadow. As the clouds moved fast and low, the land below accepting all of it with the same flat neutrality it brought to everything. 8 miles back, the Abilene Depot sat at the end of the rail line, where civilization frayed into frontier. In the post office on Main Street, the letter to Mrs. Harriet Boone's registry, requesting a plain-looking, homely, ugly wife, was 3 weeks gone and not coming back. Ezra Colt stood in his doorway and watched Mabel Ashford examine the structural integrity of his pantry shelf with the focused attention of a woman who had decided, apparently somewhere between Independence and Abilene, that this was her pantry now. He had asked for someone with no better options. He was no longer certain who in this specific doorway had the fewer options. The Kansas quiet pressed down outside. Inside, for the first time in 4 winters, it didn't. The first week at Dry Willow Creek followed a logic that Ezra Colt had not anticipated, which was the logic of someone who had arrived with a plan of her own. He had expected an adjustment period, some cautious circling of unfamiliar territory, some deference to the established order of a household that had been running, however imperfectly, under one person's management for 4 years. What he got was Monday. On Monday, Mabel Ashford rose before him. He was accustomed to rising before the light, a habit built from years of livestock demanding attention on a schedule indifferent to human preference. He came out of his bunk at 5, dressed in the dark, out of long practice, pulled on his boots, opened the cabin door. The cook stove was already lit. The smell of coffee was already in the air. Mabel was at the north wall with a bucket of clay mixture she had apparently prepared the previous evening after he had gone to sleep, working the chinking into the gaps between the logs with a wooden paddle she had fashioned from a scrapboard in the time it took him to become aware that she was doing it. He stood in the doorway with one boot not fully on. She did not turn around. "Coffee's ready," she said, the paddle moving in steady horizontal strokes. "The clay wants 30 minutes to set before the temperature drops tonight. I'd like to get 2 more sections done before we lose the morning warmth." He pulled on the boot. He poured the coffee. He drank it standing by the window, watching the south pasture where the cattle were moving in their morning pattern, trying to identify what he was feeling. It was not irritation. It was something closer to the sensation of reaching for a fence rail that has been moved 6 inches from where you built it. By Tuesday, the pantry had been reorganized with a thoroughness that suggested prior preparation. He found upon examination a written inventory in Mabel's compact, precise handwriting, every item on every shelf, its quantity, its estimated remaining useful life, its shelf position. Items relocated to a new order, grouped by use rather than by the approximate logic of a man who put things where there was space. 3 items were placed separately on the table with a small notation beside each. One was a tin of salt pork set apart with a single mark that required no verbal elaboration. He picked it up. He could not identify the year he had purchased it with any confidence. He set it back down. She had already turned to the stove. Wednesday's biscuits were something he was not prepared for. He was a competent cook in the specific sense of a man who has fed himself adequately for years without ever once experiencing genuine pleasure in the eating. The biscuits that came out of his cook stove, which was the same cook stove that had produced his competent, adequate food for a decade, were architecturally sound, properly browned, and when he bit into the first one, it was so far from anything he had been producing in that kitchen that he sat down at the table and ate 3 more before he trusted himself to speak. He did not say anything about them. Some responses were larger than the situation seemed to allow for. Thursday changed everything. He had taken her out to look at the cattle, expecting the kind of polite engagement a person offers to be agreeable. Some questions about the animals in general. Some observation about how many there were. He was prepared to explain things at the level of first introduction. Instead, walking the fence line of the south pasture, with the March wind pushing flat across the open ground, Mabel stopped at the fence rail, looked at the bull working the far side of the field and said, "Is that Rocking H bloodline? Or is that the line coming out of the Smoky Hill operation near Junction City?" Ezra stopped walking. The wind moved between them for a moment. "Rocking H," he said carefully. "Bought him at auction in Salina, spring of '76. She studied the bull with the unhurried attention of someone who knows what they're looking for. "The Rocking H bull I read about in the livestock circular last fall had a shoulder conformation issue on the left side. This one looks cleaner." She paused. "Did they resolve the conformation problem in the '75 breeding season, or did this animal come from a different dam line?" Ezra Colt looked at this woman who had been on his property for 4 days. He looked at the bull. He looked back at the woman. Something in his face asked a question his voice had not yet formed. She met his eyes directly the way she met everything, without performance, without apology. "I read, is that a problem?" It was not a problem. It was in the catalog of unexpected things that had arrived with Mabel Ashford from Independence, Missouri, the most startling. He had not been startled by the chinking, or the pantry, or the biscuits. Those were within the range of remarkable but categorizable competence. This was different. This was the discovery that the person he had imported to manage his domestic situation had opinions about cattle bloodlines in 2 counties. Opinions that were not decorative, but informed, rooted in reading, he could not dismiss because he had done some of it himself. He walked the rest of the fence line explaining the Rocking H breeding history in more detail than he had ever explained it to anyone, including himself. She asked 2 questions that were better than the ones he would have asked. He answered both. The wind kept moving. The cattle ignored them. He did not know what to do with any of this. Harlan Duff came by on a Friday afternoon in the 3rd week of March, ostensibly to discuss the condition of the fence line they shared along the creek's north bank, which had been needing attention since the previous fall. Ezra recognized the actual purpose of the visit without requiring it to be stated. He led Harlan to the south fence line, pointed out the posts that needed resetting, began discussing the spring schedule for the work. Mabel was at the cabin. He was aware of this with the particular awareness of a man trying not to be aware of something. Harlan glanced toward the cabin once with the careful casualness of someone who has already composed his reaction in advance. After perhaps 20 minutes of fence line discussion that had mostly been accomplished by the first 5 minutes, Mabel came out of the cabin with a clay bucket to address a section of the exterior east wall she had identified as needing attention. She saw Harlan nodded once in his direction with the same directness she brought to everything and went to work on the wall. Harlan watched her for a moment without obvious expression. Then he turned back to the fence and made no remark for a while. When Mabel had gone back inside with the empty bucket, Harlan pushed his hat back on his head. "She's not what you asked for," he said in the tone of a man delivering a weather report. Ezra kept his eyes on the fence line. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean." Harlan picked up a loose fence nail from the ground, examined it, set it on a post. "She is not what you put in that letter. She is not even close to what you put in that letter." He let that settle for a moment. Then levelly, "She's better looking than Lillian Hayes." The name landed the way it always landed, like a stone dropped into still water. The impact brief, the ripples lasting longer. Ezra said nothing. Harlan was quiet for a moment longer, then said what Ezra understood to be the actual reason for the visit. "You have a problem with it." It was not a question. Ezra's jaw moved slightly. He looked at the cattle in the south pasture. He looked at the fence line. He looked at the middle distance where Kansas commits to being entirely itself and makes no concessions. Then, with the particular difficulty of a man admitting something he has been building a wall against for 4 years, that's exactly it. Harlan picked up the fence nail again, turned it between 2 fingers. He did not say anything else, which was one of the things about Harlan Duff that Ezra valued. Some men fill the silence with reassurance. Harlan Duff understood that some silences are where a man does his necessary work. The First Methodist Church of Abilene held its October social in the 3rd week of the month, when the harvest was close enough to finish that people could justify an evening away from the remaining work. The social was not optional for a man who had recently acquired a wife on trial via a matrimonial registry in St. Louis. The social was in the specific economy of a small Kansas town, in 1878 a presentation. Abilene had been waiting since March. Abilene's patience had run to its natural limit sometime around August. Ezra understood all of this. He dressed in the good shirt, which was the regular shirt laundered, hitched the wagon, and they drove the 8 miles to town in the October dark, with the first real cold of the season coming off the plains from the northwest. Mabel wore a dress she had sewn herself from cloth, ordered through the dry goods store, a deep, practical blue that was not trying to be anything other than what it was. She sat beside him on the wagon bench and said nothing for 6 miles, which was not unusual. On the seventh mile, she said, "Tell me who matters in that room." He told her, Judge Warren Holt, who held court in Dickinson County and whose opinion organized most of the opinion around him. Reverend Silas Greer, whose formal opinion was ecclesiastical, but whose actual opinion ranged considerably wider. The Caldwell women, three sisters, whose collective memory constituted the closest thing Abilene had to a public record. Tom Vester at the feed store, who knew every piece of financial news in the county 6 weeks before it happened. He listed them without editorial comment. She listened without interrupting. "The judge," she said. "What does he do with people who disagree with him?" Ezra considered. "Depends on whether he's right." She looked at the dark road ahead. What if he isn't? He had no specific answer for that because in his experience of Abilene, the question had rarely been worth testing. The social was everything a Dickinson County church social in 1878 was designed to be functional communal operating under the codes that small communities developed to manage the fact that everyone must continue to live adjacent to everyone else, regardless of what they think of each other. The food was on long tables by the east wall. The conversation moved in the established patterns of people who have been having the same conversations for years, with occasional new material substituted in. Mabel Ashford navigated the room the way she navigated the South Pasture fence line, with attention without performance. She spoke to the Caldwell sisters who had clearly prepared opinions and were revising them in real time with visible effort. She spoke to Tom Vester with the directness she brought to everything, asking about feed prices in terms specific enough that Vester looked at her sideways for a moment before answering with more precision than he typically offered. She ate sparingly, held her cup with both hands in the cold of the unheated side room, listened more than she spoke. Ezra watched from the position near the refreshment table that a man occupies when he is ostensibly present socially but is actually gathering information. The moment with Judge Warren Holt arrived approximately an hour into the evening, in the natural way that such moments arrive when one of the parties in the room is a judge, accustomed to defining the terms of conversation. Holt was 61 years old, large in the manner of a man who has eaten well at other people's expense for most of his career, with a white beard he maintained, with an attention that bordered on vanity. He had been discussing the proposed new road east of town, a project that had been under consideration for 2 seasons, with the central question being whether the route should run along the ridgeline or follow the creek bed, a difference of approximately half a mile in length, but significant implications for drainage, flood access, seasonal usability. Holt held the ridge position with the confidence of a man whose position has not yet been seriously questioned. He had been explaining it to the cluster of men around him. Vester, two farmers from the east side of the county. Reverend Greer, when Mabel, who had been near enough to hear for some minutes, said with the same directness she brought to pantry organization. The ridge road floods the creekside farms in the spring runoff. The water has nowhere to go but across lower ground. The room did not go entirely quiet. It went the particular quiet of a room where the ambient noise continues, but the attention has relocated. Holt turned to look at her with the specific expression of a man who is deciding how much weight to give a statement based on who said it and has not yet completed the calculation. "The ridge provides elevation," he said, the tone of someone finishing a point. Mabel set down her cup on the nearby table. "Elevation doesn't resolve the drainage problem on the Kettner property or the Haas property below it. Both of those farms run their drainage west in spring. A ridge road cuts that flow's natural exit. The creek bed route is longer, but it follows the existing water logic of the land." She was not aggressive. She was not performing certainty. She was stating what she understood to be accurate in the same tone she used to describe the need for a second pantry shelf, which was to say the tone of someone who has looked at the problem. Holt's expression completed its calculation. It came out wrong for Holt. "You are describing terrain you have not yet seen in a spring flood." Mabel picked up her cup again. "I'm describing what the land does with water based on its grade. The spring will confirm it one way or the other." She looked at him with her direct green eyes for exactly as long as the statement required, then turned to ask Reverend Greer's wife something about the quality of the fall harvest. The conversation moving forward as if the previous 2 minutes had been entirely routine. The cluster around Holt redistributed itself in the subtle way that people redistribute when the room's weight has shifted. Ezra from the refreshment table watched this happen. He felt something move in his chest, something that arrived unannounced without his authorization that he did not immediately name because naming it would require him to acknowledge it was there. On the ride home, the October dark pressing in from both sides of the road, Mabel said, "Your Judge Holt doesn't like being corrected in company." "He doesn't like being corrected by anyone?" The wagon wheels found a rut in the dark road. She steadied herself without reaching for him. "Was I wrong about the creek bed route?" He looked at the horse's back, the dark road ahead, the stars over Kansas that were numerous enough at this distance from town to constitute a kind of conversation themselves. "Creek bed floods in spring. You were right." She was quiet for a moment, then simply good. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just the clean acknowledgement of a thing being what it should be. As if rightness was its own complete reward, requiring no additional commentary. He looked straight ahead at the dark road and understood with the flat certainty that had always characterized his most significant understandings that he was in serious trouble. Not because she was right about the road, because of the way being right was to her entirely sufficient. He had never met anyone for whom that was true. He had spent his adult life in a county where rightness was always secondary to who was doing the being right. Mabel Ashford operated in a different system entirely, one where the substance of a thing mattered more than its packaging, and he did not know what to do with someone who lived that way in a world that mostly didn't. He drove the 8 miles and said nothing else. She did not require him to. The letter happened on a Thursday night in early November, 3 weeks after the church social. He had been sitting at the table after supper, which had become a different kind of sitting than it used to be. Mabel at the other chair, with a livestock circular, him with the farm ledger, the lamp between them, the stove providing the even warmth of a fire that was being managed rather than merely burning. It was not a romantic arrangement. It was a functional one, 2 people sharing light because light was a resource. But it had a quality. He did not have a word for the quality of something that had organized itself without being arranged. He had looked up from the ledger at some point and watched her read for a moment, her attention total. Nothing performed about it, a person genuinely inside the thing she was reading before he looked back down at the numbers. The numbers had stopped meaning what numbers meant. He stared at them for a while. After she went to sleep, he pulled out a sheet of paper from the desk drawer. He wrote to Mrs. Harriet Boone. He wrote carefully in the measured handwriting that told the story of a man controlling his pace deliberately. He wrote that upon further consideration the arrangement had proven unsuitable, that the candidate, while possessing the practical qualities described in her correspondence, had not aligned with the stated requirements, that he would appreciate Mrs. Boone's assistance in processing a conclusion to the trial arrangement, and that he was prepared to provide Miss Ashford with return fare to Independence, as the registry's standard term specified. He wrote it, he folded it, he set it on the table in front of him. He looked at it for an hour. The lamp burned down a 1/4 inch. Outside, November had its hands against the cabin walls, feeling for weaknesses in the chinking. From the north wall, the rechinking holding clean, there was no draft. He thought about the draft that had come through that wall every winter for 3 years before last Monday. He thought about what it had cost him in firewood across 3 winters, the slow, invisible expense of a wall that needed attention he had not given it. He thought about Mabel Ashford working that wall for 2 hours in the pre-dawn cold of a March morning before he had fully pulled on his boots, because she had looked at it the previous evening, assessed it, formed a plan, executed the plan. He thought about what it meant that the wall was now sound. He thought about what it meant that a man could live 3 winters with a draft coming through his north wall without fixing it, not because he lacked the knowledge or the materials, but because fixing a thing requires you to first believe the thing is yours enough to be worth fixing. He had been living in this cabin for 11 years. He had been fixed in it for perhaps less time than that in the way that mattered. He looked at the folded letter. He was not sending the letter because his plan had failed. His plan had failed, the plan that specified an uncomplicated, undemanding, architecturally simple domestic arrangement with a woman who had no better options. That plan was gone. What had replaced it was considerably more complicated, more demanding, more structurally significant, built on a foundation he had not laid intentionally, which was the most alarming kind of foundation because it meant he was not in control of what was being built. He was not sending the letter because he had changed his mind about the risk. The risk was larger than it had been in March, not smaller because what he stood to lose was now larger. A woman with no options represented a contained risk. Mabel Ashford represented a risk with no calculable ceiling because she had every option. She was competent, direct, well-read, and possessed of a face that stopped rooms without trying. She could go anywhere. She could write to Mrs. Boone herself tomorrow and be on a train to somewhere better constituted within the month. He was not sending the letter because the only reason he could articulate for sending it was fear. Specifically the same fear that had been making his decisions for 4 years, the fear of standing in a public place and being found insufficient. He had disguised that fear as practicality. He had dressed it in the language of sensible planning. He had written it, in the end, into a letter to a matrimonial registry as a requirement for ugly. The disguise had been convincing. The practicality had been real. The fear underneath it was also real, and it had been running the operation longer than he was comfortable acknowledging. Ezra Colt had built 38 acres in Dickinson County. He had never in his adult life done a thing because he was afraid of not doing it. He had done things because they were right, because they were necessary, because the work demanded it. Fear was a signal. It was not a plan. He left the folded letter on the table. He went to his bunk. He did not sleep for a while. In the morning, the letter was still on the table, and he left it there when he went out to see to the cattle. He left it there the next day, too. It accumulated 2 days of existing on the table before Mabel moved it without comment to the side of the desk when she was clearing the table for supper. He watched her move it from across the room and felt the specific quality of a man watching a thing happen that he has been unable to do himself. 3 days after that, she found it. He didn't know precisely when she did not announce it. He came in from the east fence line at midday to find her standing at the desk with the letter in her hand, reading it with the same attending focus she brought to livestock circulars. Her back was to him. She finished reading. She folded it along its original crease. She turned around. She did not look wounded. She did not look accusatory. She looked at him with a directness that was simply how she looked at things, no more or less than what the situation required. Her voice, when it came, was steady, with the kind of steadiness that is made rather than natural. "How long ago did you write this?" He told her. She absorbed the information. She set the letter back on the desk precisely where she had found it. Then she did something he had not predicted. She sat down in the chair across from him, folded her hands on the table, looked at him with those direct green eyes and said, "Ask me what you actually want to ask me." He looked at her for a long moment. The stove ticked once in the silence. Then, with the difficulty of a man dismantling something he has spent years constructing, "Why are you here?" She looked at him without blinking. "Because your letter was the only letter I received that didn't ask what I looked like." The sentence sat in the room. He looked at the desk, at the wall, at the floor that was real planked wood, real floor, real construction, his own hands. Then he looked back at her. "I wrote that letter," he said slowly, "because I was afraid." It was the first time he had said it. The sentence sounded different outside his head, smaller in the way that fears become smaller when they are stated plainly, the way a shadow on the wall shrinks when you move the lamp closer to the object casting it. Mabel looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. "I knew at the train station. I watched you holding your hat." A pause, deliberate, the kind that carries weight. "You are not afraid of hard work. You are not afraid of a bad winter. You are afraid of being left again." The accuracy of it was like a door coming off its hinges, the structure still standing, but no longer able to close against anything. He looked at her. She looked back. In the silence that followed, something that had been building since March, since a train platform, since an inventory list, since a conversation about rocking H bloodlines in a cold south pasture, shifted in its weight. She did not say anything else. She stood, moved to the stove to check the pot she had set to simmer before he came in, and did not look at him again for a while. Not cruelty, precision. She had said the accurate thing. It did not require supplementation. He sat at the table. The folded letter was on the desk where she had replaced it. He sat with the novel, uncomfortable sensation of a man who has been seen clearly by another person for the first time in longer than he could reliably calculate. He left the letter on the desk. He did not send it. He would not send it. Not because the fear was gone, it wasn't gone. It was still there, the same size it had always been. But because he had, sitting at his own table in the late November light, run out of reasons that were better than the fear itself. November deepened into December with the specific intention that Kansas Decembers bring to the task. The light contracted. The ground froze to the depth that made any outdoor work either essential or impossible, with no middle category. The days organized themselves around the livestock's requirements, and Ezra found that the division of work had, without formal arrangement, distributed itself between them according to ability rather than convention. Mabel took the indoor management, the kitchen, the supply inventory, the systematic preparation of the cabin for genuine cold. He took the livestock, the fencing, the firewood. Where the work required both of them, they worked without negotiating it, the distribution happening the way it happens between two people who have been paying attention to each other's capacities. He came in from splitting wood one evening in the first week of December to find her at the table with the Prairie Homesteader's companion open to the section on winter preparation, a piece of paper beside it with notes in her compact handwriting. She was cross-referencing the manual's advice with what she had observed about the actual conditions on the property, checking the manual's generalizations against the specific reality of 38 acres on Dry Willow Creek. He stood in the doorway with an armful of wood watching her work, feeling the thing in his chest that he had been carefully not naming for 6 weeks. The lamp made her hair look darker than it was, the auburn gone to something richer. She turned a page without looking up. He carried the wood to the stack by the stove. He set it down without making more noise than necessary. He did not look at her again because looking had become a thing that required more management than it used to. That evening, with the December wind finding every exterior gap it could locate, and the stove working its steady argument against the cold, he sat across from her at the table and said something that had been in the vicinity of his mouth for several weeks without successfully becoming words. "You said at the station that I looked surprised, not disappointed." She looked up from the companion. She waited. "I was both," he said. He said it to the table, then corrected this and said it to her face. "I was both, surprised because you weren't what I had constructed, disappointed because you weren't, and that meant the plan was done." A pause in which he decided to finish the thing. The disappointment was gone by the time we reached the south pasture. She was quiet for a moment that had the quality of something being weighed rather than considered. Then, "Why are you telling me this now?" He thought about the letter on the desk. He thought about the north wall chinking holding. He thought about 4 winters in a cabin that had been missing something he had been misidentifying as quiet. "Because you asked me to ask what I actually wanted to ask. I'm asking late." He looked at her steadily, with the directness he had always reserved for things that mattered. "I would like you to stay." The lamplight held between them. Outside December put its weight against the walls. She looked at him for a long moment with those direct green eyes, and he could not read what was behind them, not because she was concealing it, but because what was there was complex in the way that real things are complex when they have been thought about for a long time. "I'll stay," she said. Then, with the smallest trace of something that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same territory. "The south pasture grazing rotation still needs addressing before spring." He nodded once with the gravity of a man who has just accepted the terms of an agreement that is going to change the structure of everything. He pulled the farm ledger toward him. She turned back to the companion. The lamp burned between them, steady in the still air of a cabin with a north wall that no longer drafted. 4 days later, the sky above the Kansas plains turned yellow-gray in the late afternoon, a particular shade that Ezra Colt had learned to read the way other men read bank statements. He stood in the yard after supper looking northwest where the color was coming from, assessing what it meant. It meant business. It meant the kind of business that required everything done tonight, that could be done tonight, because tomorrow the option would be closed. He spent the last 3 hours of daylight moving cattle to the lower pasture, where the natural windbreak of the creek bank would give them some geometry against what was coming. He broke ice on the water trough that had already begun to form despite it being only early December, which was itself a fact about what was coming. He moved firewood from the outdoor stack to the interior pile until there was enough for 3 days, then added more for the 4th. He checked every door and every outbuilding twice. When he came in, Mabel had tripled the food preparation. Every pot, every container, every vessel of suitable size now held water drawn from the 40-foot well. She had banked the stove with the deliberate architecture of someone who has read exactly what Kansas winters can demand and has taken the reading seriously. She had laid out everything that might be needed near the door in the order it might be needed: coats, scarves, the second lantern, the extra oil in the small cans she kept on the left side of the pantry shelf. They ate supper without much conversation, both of them aware of what the northwest sky had said. The wind arrived around 10 first as a sound at the eaves, then as a force. By midnight, it was the kind of wind that has forgotten that the world contains anything other than itself. Ezra was in his bunk not sleeping, listening to the cabin perform its structural arguments against the cold when it came, the sound from the barn cutting through the wind's noise with the particular quality of an animal in genuine distress. His best heifer. He knew the voice of her distress the way a man knows the sounds of a place he has lived in for 11 years. He was dressed and at the door before he was fully awake, in the way that a man who has spent his life responding to livestock emergencies is never entirely asleep during a storm. He did not think about Mabel. He thought about the heifer, about what that sound meant 6 weeks early, wrong presentation in the worst weather of the season. He pulled the door open against the wind's resistance. She was already there. Coat on the second lantern lit, her scarf wrapped twice around her head with the practical efficiency of someone who had prepared for this before she went to sleep, because she had looked at that sky at supper and had not needed to be told what it meant. She looked at him with the same directness she brought to everything, without explanation, without ceremony. "You need a second pair of hands," she said. The wind took the words almost before they arrived. He looked at her. He looked at the wall of dark and cold beyond the door. He calculated, because he was a man who calculated 30 below. Maybe worse, with the wind's opinion of the temperature half a mile to the barn, a situation in that barn that was going to require everything he had. He opened his mouth. "I can count," she said before he could produce a reason. She stepped through the door and into the blizzard. He followed her. He would think about that later, in the specific way a man thinks about the moment a thing reversed on him that he had not led, that he had followed, that she had walked into a Kansas blizzard in December at 2 in the morning without being asked, because she had assessed the situation and determined she was needed, and that this was the same logic she brought to the north wall and the pantry shelf and the south pasture grazing rotation and Judge Warren Holt's road argument. The logic of a person who looks at what needs doing, determines it needs doing, does it. The cold was a physical thing, not a temperature, but a presence, something with weight and intention. The wind did not blow so much as occupy, filling every space between them the moment they stepped outside. Mabel moved without hesitation toward the barn, the lantern she carried throwing a small stubborn circle of light that the blizzard pushed at from every side without extinguishing. He caught up to her on the second step. Together they crossed the yard to the barn door, which he pulled open against the wind's objection, a full second of physical argument before the door gave. They went inside. The barn's relative warmth hit them like a wall in reverse, not warm but less assaultive than the outside, the livestock's collected heat having turned the space into something a degree above survivable. The heifer was in the far stall. Ezra went to her, directly going to one knee in the straw hands on her flank, reading what her body said with the knowledge of a man who had been doing this long enough to know the difference between difficult and desperate. Breech. He had lost 2 calves to breech birth in 6 years of ranching, both times alone. Both times because he could not hold the lantern steady with one hand while working with both. He looked up at Mabel. She looked back at him. She lifted the lantern to the height the situation required. Her face said, "I understand what you need. Do what you need to do." He went to work. He worked by feel for the first few minutes, his hands reading what his eyes could not fully see in the lantern's range, the heifer's breathing coming in the hard, irregular rhythm of an animal that has been working without progress for too long. The straw beneath his knees was cold through the denim. The barn's collected warmth, which had seemed adequate when they first came in from the blizzard's full assault, proved itself insufficient by degrees. Not cold enough to stop a man working, cold enough to make every minute of working cost something extra. Mabel held the lantern at the precise height required without being told what that height was. She had assessed the situation in the first 30 seconds and positioned herself where the light would do the most work. Her arm extended at the angle that kept the flame from the wind coming through the barn's imperfect seams. He was aware of her the way a man working in difficult conditions is aware of the one thing making the work possible, not with attention to spare, but with the peripheral knowledge that the necessary thing was being done. Breech presentation meant time was the enemy. Not a distant enemy, but a present one, already in the stall with them already counting. He had lost the first calf to breech 6 years ago because he had not understood the timeline quickly enough. He had lost the second because he had understood the timeline, but had no one to hold a light. Both times the work had been done in the dark, in the most important sense, without the right conditions for doing it correctly. Both times the loss had been a fact he filed and moved past because that was what the work required. He did not intend to file this one. His hands found the calf's position. He began the deliberate, careful work of correction that brooked no hurrying, because hurrying at this stage was the same as quitting. The heifer's trust in what he was doing was expressed in the language of livestock under extreme stress. Not trust exactly, but the absence of fight. The animal's body acknowledging that the human's intervention was preferable to the alternative. He spoke to her in the low, continuous murmur he had developed over years of working animals in distress. Not words exactly, just the sound of a human voice maintaining its steadiness as a form of information. Things can still go right. 20 minutes in the cold had moved from background condition to active participant. He could feel it in the joints of his fingers, that particular stiffness that comes before numbness, which was itself a warning, because numbness meant loss of the fine sensation he needed. He adjusted his hands. He kept working. 30 minutes in, he became aware that the lantern's light had changed, a subtle shift in the warmth of its color, the flame burning slightly lower as the oil diminished. He could not look up. He heard Mabel make a small sound, not alarm, more the sound of someone encountering a problem and immediately moving to its solution. A brief, contained movement on her end. The light steadied. He did not ask. He kept his eyes on the work. What she had done, he would learn this afterward, when there was time to learn things, was remove the long scarf she had wrapped twice around her head before leaving the cabin. She wound it around the base of the lantern's oil reservoir, insulating the metal against the cold that was thickening the oil and starving the flame. It bought the flame another degree of life. It cost her the only insulation she had between her ears and the December air inside the barn, which was performing a credible imitation of the December air outside. She made no comment about this transaction. She held the lantern steady at the required angle. The flame did not waver. He felt the calf's position shift under his hands. The correction was taking. He worked with the focused patience of a man who has learned that this particular kind of patience is not a virtue, but a technical requirement, that impatience at this stage does not accelerate the outcome, it prevents it. The heifer's breathing changed. He recognized the change. At some point past 50 minutes, he had been counting in the way he always counted during work like this. Not the clock on the wall, but the internal count of a man using numbers as a handhold against the vertigo of an outcome. He cannot guarantee the calf came. Wet shaking, small in the specific way that living things are small when they have just accomplished the largest thing they will ever do. He caught it. He set it in the cleaner straw away from the berth. He pressed both hands against it, feeling for the particular quality of warmth that means a life intending to continue. It was there, faint, determined. There. He stayed on his knees for a moment longer than necessary, his hands on the calf's side, feeling it breathe. The heifer turned to find it the ancient recognition moving in her with the certainty of something older than any of them. He watched the calf accept being found. He stood. He turned around. Mabel's arm was still extended at the lantern height. It had been extended at that height for the entirety of the work. Her hand had locked itself around the lantern's handle in the grip of muscles that had been holding a single position in severe cold for longer than muscles are designed to do this without relief. And they had decided somewhere in the last 10 minutes that they were no longer taking instruction. Her face had gone the color of tallow, not white, exactly more the color of light through old bone, the color a person goes when the body has redirected its resources away from the surface and toward the center where the necessary machinery lives. She had not said anything. She had not moved the lantern from its position. The flame had not moved. He crossed the stall to her in 2 steps. He took the lantern from her hand, which required more than simply reaching for it, because the hand had to be opened, each finger addressed individually and separated from the handle by his own hands, working from the outside. He set the lantern in the straw. He took both her hands in both of his. Her hands were beyond cold in the specific way that goes past sensation into something more serious. He had seen this before in men who had been caught out in Kansas winters without adequate preparation, the hands that look normal but have stopped sending reliable information back to the brain about where they are. He held her hands between his and breathed on them. Not quickly. He breathed on them with the steady rhythm of someone who understands that the return of circulation to cold-damaged extremities is not a thing that can be rushed, that rushing it produces its own damage. He worked from the wrists in each finger in sequence, the way you coax heat back into an almost failed fire, from the existing warmth outward, patient, committed to the process. She let him do this. She did not apologize for the condition of her hands. She did not say anything for a long moment, standing in the straw of the Dry Willow Creek barn, while the blizzard conducted its argument with the roof overhead, and the calf breathed its careful new breaths in the corner, and the heifer made the low sound that is not quite contentment, but is adjacent to it. Then Mabel Ashford said in the tone of someone picking up a conversation that had been briefly interrupted rather than one beginning a new one. Your letter said you were looking for a plain wife. His hands kept working on hers. He did not look up immediately. When he did, his eyes found hers in the lantern light, which was low now, the flame reduced to what the diminished oil could sustain. Your letter said you were plain. A silence that had weather in it, not the blizzard's weather, something interior. The calf shifted in the straw. The heifer made her low sound again. Mabel looked at him with the directness that was, he had learned over 9 months, not a performance of confidence, but simply what she looked like when she was being entirely herself. No layer between what she thought and what her face showed. I was describing my character, she said. I thought that was the relevant part. He held her hands between his. The warmth was coming back by degrees, he could feel it, the slow return of suppleness to fingers that had been locked beyond their tolerance. He kept his hands around hers and did not move away. You thought right, he said. The sentence sat between them in the barn's dim warmth, plain as the Sunday sermon she had compared herself to in her first letter plain. In the way that accurate things are plain, not simple, not without depth, but without pretense, stripped of everything that was not the essential thing. He was still holding her hands. Neither of them moved to change this. The blizzard pressed against the barn's walls with the indifference of weather toward all human arrangements, finding no purchase on what was inside. The morning after the blizzard came in the particular way that mornings after Kansas blizzards come, with a stillness so complete it seemed like an apology from the previous night's violence, the world white and rebuilt, and offering no evidence that it had recently tried to dismantle itself. The cold was worse than the night before, the wind's absence making the temperature's true position legible for the first time. But the sky was the color of iron going to blue, the kind of sky that commits to clearing, and the cattle in the lower pasture were standing, which was the first information Ezra went to verify at first light. He went to the barn directly after. The calf was on its feet, unsteady, investigating the world, with the tentative confidence of something that has not yet learned what the world can be, only what it has been so far, which was warm enough to suggest the enterprise was worthwhile. The heifer was attending to the calf with the focused devotion of an animal whose body has organized itself around a single purpose. He checked both animals with the thoroughness of a man who does not trust last night's good outcome to automatically extend into this morning's good outcome. It extended. He let out a breath he had been carrying since 2 in the morning. He named the calf that morning, standing alone in the stall with the winter light coming through the barn's east gap. He had not planned to name it. He named it February, which was not the current month the calendar said December, but which was the month the animal should have been born if it had followed the plan before the blizzard had its opinion about the timeline. He named it for the gap between what was planned and what actually happened, because that gap, he was beginning to understand, was where the things worth having tended to live. Mabel's hands had recovered through the night. He had sat with her at the kitchen table after they came in from the barn, the lamp turned up, both of them still in their outdoor clothes, because the cold had followed them inside, in the particular way it follows people who have been out in it seriously. He had made coffee, which was not a thing he typically did. It had always been her province in the months she'd been there, but her hands were not yet fully operational, her fingers still working their way back from the locked position. So he made it and set it in front of her, and she wrapped both hands around the cup and said nothing about the reversal of the usual order. They had sat like that for a while, drinking coffee in the aftermath of the barn, the blizzard tapering outside from full conviction to a sustained complaint. Neither of them said much. The silence had the quality of something that has been resolved, not the tense quiet of unresolved things, not the hollow quiet of a room that is empty in the meaningful sense, but the quiet of two people who have just done something difficult together and are in the presence of the fact of it. He had looked at her hands around the cup and thought about 50-some minutes at a lantern height that would have made any reasonable person's arm fail in 30, about a scarf unwound from a head in a cold barn to insulate a lamp's oil reservoir, about every pantry shelf, every line of rechinking, every question about grazing rotation that had landed in the first 8 miles between a train station and a creek named Dry Willow. He thought about a letter on a desk that he had not sent. He thought about what it means to be a man who does not do things out of fear, and how much of his life he had organized around that self-understanding, and how long it had taken him to see that not sending the letter was the first honest thing that self-understanding had produced in 4 years. Reverend Silas Greer came to the ranch on a Thursday in January, which was the kind of Thursday that January in Kansas produces cold, with the flat commitment of a season that knows it has months left on its contract. He came ostensibly to call on a parishioner, which was within his established habits, but the timing and the particular quality of his expression when Ezra opened the door suggested a pastoral concern that had been accumulating since October. He came in, took the chair offered, accepted the coffee. Mabel sat in front of him with the careful courtesy of a man who is about to say something he has prepared. He looked at Ezra. He looked at Mabel. He looked at the cabin, the organized pantry visible through the doorway, the second shelf tier Mabel had built in October, the rechinking on the north wall, the bookshelf Ezra had not yet built but would. The registry standard terms. Reverend Greer began with the measured pace of a man who has decided that directness is kinder than circumnavigation. Specify 6 months as the trial period. March to September by my accounting. He paused. It's January. Ezra looked at him. Mabel looked at her coffee cup. The arrangement wants formalizing, Greer said. Not a question. The tone of a man whose profession has given him a long experience of recognizing when a thing is already decided and requires only the ceremony that makes it legible to the community around it. Ezra looked at Mabel. She looked up from the cup and met his eyes with the directness that was simply how she occupied a room. He said with the economy of a man for whom superfluous words have always represented a category of waste he found unconvincing. February if the ground's passable. Mabel looked at the Reverend. February, shush, she confirmed with the same tone she used to confirm that the creek bed route was the correct one for the road, the tone of a thing being what it should be. Greer nodded once with the satisfied economy of a man whose errand has concluded in the expected manner. He finished his coffee, discussed the condition of the county roads, after the December blizzard, said he would post the announcement the following Sunday, and drove back toward town in the January cold, with the manner of a man whose work here was complete. After the door closed behind him, the cabin was quiet for a moment. Then Mabel said, without looking up from clearing the Reverend's cup, I'll need cloth from the dry goods store, blue not gray. He looked at her, a question forming. She answered it before it arrived. Gray is for traveling. I'm done traveling. The wedding took place on a Saturday in February 1879, which was the earliest the roads were passable following a second blizzard in late January that had expressed its opinion about the county's infrastructure for 6 days before relenting. The ceremony was at the First Methodist Church of Abilene, conducted by Reverend Greer, attended by Harlan Duff. As the sole representative of Ezra's social world, 3 of the Caldwell sisters, Tom Vester, from the feed store, and a scattering of Abilene residents whose curiosity had been accruing since March. Mabel wore the blue dress she had sewn herself from cloth that Ezra had driven to the dry goods store to select a task he had undertaken with the focused seriousness he brought to selecting cattle at auction, examining bolt after bolt until he found the blue that was the right blue, which was not a bright blue or a fashionable blue, but a deep settled blue, the color of a Kansas sky 2 hours after sunrise, when the day has committed to being what it's going to be. The proprietor of the dry goods store, who had been selling cloth in Abilene for 9 years later, told his wife that he had never seen a man take longer to select a color, nor one who appeared more certain once selected that he had the right one. Ezra wore the good shirt. The ceremony was brief in the way that Reverend Greer's ceremonies tended toward brevity when the parties involved had made their decision well in advance of the formal occasion, and the ceremony represented acknowledgement rather than deliberation. The vows were the standard vows. Ezra said them in the tone of a man making a contract he intends to honor exactly as written. Mabel said them in the tone of a woman who has read the contract, found it accurate, and is prepared to sign. Harlan Duff, standing at Ezra's left, looked at the floor during the ceremony with the expression of a man experiencing an emotion he would deny if asked about it directly. The reception was the coffee and cake that the Caldwell sisters had organized, which was the Abilene custom, the community's contribution to the occasion, in the form of calories and continued observation. Judge Warren Holt appeared, briefly shook Ezra's hand with the formality of a man maintaining dignity. After October, nodded to Mabel with the stiff respect of someone who has lost a public argument and has decided to convert the experience into something resembling gracious acknowledgement. Mabel returned the nod with the same directness she returned everything without victory in it, without anything other than the acknowledgement of a fact. On the drive back to Dry Willow Creek, the February air had the specific quality of a Kansas winter, deciding whether it is finished or merely pausing. The road was hard-packed snow over frozen ground, the horse's breath making small clouds at each step. Mabel sat beside him on the wagon bench, the blue dress under her winter coat, looking at the land with the attending focus that he no longer found surprising because it was simply how she looked at things she considered hers. He drove the 8 miles in the quiet they had developed over 10 months, the quiet of two people who had been paying attention to each other long enough that silence was a mode of conversation rather than its absence. Somewhere around the 5th mile, without preface, she said, "The south pasture rotation needs to change before spring. 2 weeks off the east section let the ground recover before the thaw." He considered this. He had been thinking the same thing since November. He had not said it because he had not been ready in November to think about the spring as a thing they would both be present for. He was ready now. "East section comes off rotation first week of February," he said. "Moves the cattle to the creekside strip until the ground's soft enough to assess." She nodded once, the nod of confirmation rather than agreement. She had already run the same calculation. They drove the remaining miles in the companionable quiet of two people whose plans have merged at the practical level, which is the deepest level, the one that holds when the others are tested. He built the bookshelf in March. He built it from boards he had cut and dried the previous autumn before Mabel arrived, when they had been intended for a repair to the root cellar that had not proven as urgent as anticipated. The boards were good pine, dried to the point where they would not warp cut to a width that suited the space he had identified on the east wall of the cabin, between the window and the corner where the chimney ran. He built it on a Sunday when the ground was soft enough to suggest spring was forming its intentions beneath the surface. He measured twice for each cut, which was his standard practice for any construction he considered permanent. He assembled it with the methodical care of a man building something he expects to outlast him, which was how he built everything on the property that mattered. The second shelf leaned slightly left. Not severely, a person might look at it and not notice immediately. But he noticed, and he showed it to Mabel not because she asked, but because it was there, and accuracy was a value he had observed that she held as a non-negotiable. She looked at the lean, ran a finger along the shelf surface and said, "Left bracket is a 1/4 inch low, comes off the wall stud at a slight angle." He took it apart. He reset the left bracket. He reassembled the shelf. The lean persisted reduced but present. He had introduced a compensating error in the reset. He took it apart again. The third attempt produced a shelf that was, when he held the level against it, within the tolerance of a man who has made a thing 3 times and understood it each time better than the time before. Mabel stacked it with the 6 books she had brought from Independence in the carpet bag, the Prairie Homesteaders Companion, the smaller livestock volume that she had, after all, returned to the Independence Lending Library via post and then written to purchase outright when the library wrote back that they had an extra copy. Her mother's recipe ledger, which was not a book in the published sense, but occupied the shelf with the authority of 1-2 volumes of natural history that she had read so many times. The spines had lost their original color. One collection of poetry she did not discuss, but read on Sunday mornings when the work permitted. The shelf held 6 books in February 1879. By February 1880, it held 17. The additional 11 arrived by post from a bookseller in Kansas City whose catalog Mabel had written away for in the spring. By 1882, a second shelf was required, which Ezra built in 2 attempts rather than 3, accounting for the stud angle in the first assembly. He read 4 of the books. He started with the livestock manual, which confirmed 2 things he knew and corrected 1 thing he had been doing wrong with the bull's winter feeding schedule. He read one of the natural history volumes, which interested him in a way he had not anticipated: the systematic observation of the world's patterns, the recording of what is there when you look carefully enough. He read the collection of poetry on a January evening when Mabel was asleep and the lamp was low, expecting to find it decorative, and finding instead that several of the poems were doing something he could not fully describe, using language in a way that made him feel that language could be a more precise instrument than he had been using it as. The last book he read in the winter of 1880 was a collection of essays by a writer named Emerson, which Mabel had included in the second order and placed on the shelf without comment. He picked it up because it was there. He read the first essay in one evening, put it down, picked it up the next evening, read it again. He read the second essay 3 times across a week. He did not tell anyone he was reading it, which was a habit of his, with things that were working on him in ways he had not yet finished understanding. He thought about it for the better part of that winter, the Emerson, the way it described the relationship between what a man builds outwardly and what he is building inside himself simultaneously, whether he knows it or not. He thought about 38 acres on Dry Willow Creek and what had been built there in the soil and the structures and the agreements that had been made without words in a barn at 2 in the morning in a December blizzard. And he thought that the man had understood something Ezra recognized from the inside. The 38 acres became 51 in 1881 when the Kettner property to the south came available, and Ezra had the capital to take it without overextending capital that existed because the herd had been managed with the precision of two people whose judgments about livestock complemented each other in the specific way that two people's judgments complement each other when one has the practical experience and the other has read everything written about the theory, and both of them are willing to be corrected. It became 67 in 1884, an additional parcel to the east that extended their reach to the creek's far bank and gave the South Pasture's rotation the room it had needed since Mabel first assessed it from a wagon bench 8 miles from the Abilene Depot. It became 94 in 1887, which was the year their third child was born and also the year the second barn was completed, the one Ezra had planned since before Lillian Hayes stood beside a Douglas Farwell at a church potluck and decided that Dry Willow Creek smelled in a wet spring. The barn was built with lumber freighted from Salina, constructed with the assistance of Harlan Duff, and 2 men from the eastern section of the county, completed in 6 weeks, and was by every measure available the right barn in the right place for the operation it served. The 3 children arrived in 1880, 1882, and 1884. 2 girls and a boy in that order. All 3 could argue before they could reliably walk, which Mabel accepted as evidence of functional minds, and Ezra accepted as consequence of having married a woman who understood that rightness was the relevant criterion and had transmitted this understanding efficiently. The oldest girl had her mother's eyes. The boy had the quality Ezra recognized in himself, the long considering silence before a conclusion that once reached was not revisited without cause. The second girl had apparently conducted her own synthesis of both parents and was operating from first principles she appeared to have developed independently. Harlan Duff ate supper at the Colt table approximately once a week for the next 20 years, which was not a formal arrangement, but had the character of one. His daughters had both married men from the eastern part of the county and lived at distances that were manageable but not close. And the Colt table on Sunday evenings was in the manner of these arrangements that grow without being planted where he belonged on the days that belonging required a specific address. He watched the 3 Colt children grow with the particular satisfaction of a man who has no stake in an outcome except the pleasure of its being a good one. February, the heifer lived 11 years, which was 2 years longer than the practical expectation for cattle of her type, and suggested that the trauma of her calf's birth night had not diminished her fundamental constitution. She produced calves across those years with the consistency of a reliable argument, 9 of them surviving to productive age, several of them becoming the foundation of the Colt herd's next generation. The last of her line, a bull calf born in 1887, was still working the South pasture when Ezra was past 50, a fact he noted with the quiet satisfaction of a man watching one good decision compound across decades. Judge Warren Holt's Ridge Road was proposed, contested, tabled, and finally abandoned in the spring of 1879 when the thaw demonstrated exactly what Mabel had described in October. The water with nowhere to go, the Kettner property's drainage blocked by the proposed route's geometry, the creek bed alternative vindicated by the season's own evidence. Holt never mentioned the church social conversation to Ezra directly. He did over the following years develop the habit of consulting Mabel Colt on matters of land use and water management in the county, which he framed as seeking the opinion of an informed resident and which everyone in Dickinson County understood for what it was. Mabel became over the years the most respected woman in Abilene in the specific way that respect accrues to people who say accurate things without regard for whether accuracy is convenient. She served on the board of the new schoolhouse from 1882. She contributed a regular letter to the County Agricultural Circular, beginning in 1885, on the subject of sustainable grazing management that was reprinted in 2 other Kansas County publications, and once, to her considerable satisfaction, in a Missouri farming journal. She did not consider these things achievements in the way the Abilene social economy considered achievements. She considered them applications of what she knew to problems that needed knowing applied to them. The distinction mattered to her. The results were the same either way. She wrote to her cousin in Independence every month for 30 years. She never described the life as more or less than it was. She described the land, the cattle, the children's arguments, the progress of the bookshelf's contents, the condition of the north wall, which had not needed re-chinked since 1878, because she had done it properly the first time. She described Ezra in the terms she used for anything she understood thoroughly, without sentiment, without reduction, with the precision of someone who has been paying attention long enough to know the difference between what a thing appears to be and what it actually is. She described him as a man of genuine quality who had spent considerable effort disguising this from himself and who had over time become less diligent about the disguise. On a Tuesday in October 1889, 11 years after February, the heifer arrived in the world in a December blizzard. Ezra drove to Harlan Duff's place along the creek with a piece of information he had been carrying since that morning. February had gone in the night, not violently, not in distress, but in the way that animals of age go when the machinery has run its course and the body decides the work is done. He had found her in the stall at first light, the same stall where she had arrived already gone, with a completeness that looked in the early morning light almost deliberate. He told Harlan over coffee in the kitchen of Harlan's house, which smelled of the same wood smoke it had always smelled of, and had the particular quality of a bachelor's house, functional, a little austere, everything in its place but nothing positioned for anyone other than the man who lived there. Harlan received the news with the gravity it warranted. They sat for a moment with it. Then Harlan said with the measured honesty of a man who has been thinking about something for a long time, "You know what I thought when you told me you wrote that letter? When you told me what you put in it?" Ezra wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I have a reasonable idea. I thought you'd lost the last of your sense." Harlan looked at the table, then at the window, then back at Ezra with the directness of a man who has decided to say the accurate thing because accurate things were the only ones worth the time. 11 years on, I'll tell you this, I was right about the letter. It was the damnedest letter. I was wrong about everything else. Ezra said nothing for a moment because what Harlan was saying was the kind of thing that deserved a moment. Then, with the economy of a man for whom the important statements had always been the short ones, that makes two of us. He drove back to Dry Willow Creek in the October afternoon, the light coming sideways across the 94 acres that had been 38 when a woman from Independence stepped off a train in a gray traveling dress and asked about his well depth before he'd thought of something to say about the weather. The cattle were in the south pasture, the rotation that had been right since March of 1879. The east section rested in its correct sequence. The second barn stood where the plan had always said it would stand. The north wall of the cabin held its chinking in the same condition it had been in since the first Monday morning of a March that felt at this distance like something from a story about different people. He told Mabel about February when he came in. She was at the table with one of the newer books, a thing she did in the October afternoons when the work had arranged itself sensibly and the light from the south window was adequate. She set the book down. She received the news with the directness she received everything fully present to it, not reducing it to something more manageable than it was. They sat with it for a moment in the way that two people who have been in the same place long enough sit with things not needing to perform the feeling, not needing to explain it. 11 years, she said, which was all the eulogy February required. The number was accurate. It was enough. Later that evening, after the children had been attended to and the lamp was burning at the level it burned, when the day was finishing, Ezra sat at the table with the farm ledger open in front of him, the ledger that now reflected 94 acres, a herd that had become the foundation stock for two neighboring operations numbers that were the material record of 20 decisions a year made well more often than not. He looked at the numbers for a while. Then he closed the ledger and looked at Mabel across the table, who was reading with the total attention she brought to everything she considered worth reading. He thought about a letter written at this table 11 years ago in the light of a lamp turned down to save oil in the quiet of a cabin that had been missing something he had spent 4 years misidentifying. He thought about what he had asked for in that letter and what had arrived in the distance between the two. He thought about the north wall that did not draft, about a lantern held at precisely the right height for 53 minutes in the worst night of a Kansas winter, about a question asked in a barn. Your letter said you were looking for a plain wife, and an answer given in the dark that had required no elaboration. He thought about the specific quality of a man who builds his walls against the wrong weather and does not realize it until someone walks through the gap he hadn't seen. He thought about what it had cost him to be the kind of man who would not send that letter. Not because the courage was particularly great, but because the alternative was to be the kind of man who runs from his own fear, and he had never been able to make that kind of man sit right in his chest. The following autumn at Tom Vester's feed store on a Tuesday morning when the harvest was coming in, and the store had the particular density of a place where men with time between loads congregate to conduct the secondary business of a county that runs on conversation as much as commerce. Ezra Colt said something to Harlan Duff that Harlan repeated afterward in the measured way that men of his type repeat the things that land correctly. He had been asked by Tom Vester, who had been curious for 12 years in the patient way of a man who understands that some information comes on its own schedule. The registry letter, the one with the request. What were you thinking? Ezra set down the grain invoice he had been reviewing. He looked at Vester, who was behind the counter with the expression of a man who has asked a legitimate question. He looked at Harlan, who was examining a bridle hook with the focused attention of a man who is listening with every part of himself while appearing to look at a bridle hook. I wrote that letter asking for ugly, Ezra said, because I was afraid. He said this with the plainness of a man who has had 12 years to make peace with a fact and has completed the work. I thought ugly meant safe. I thought safe meant I was protected from. He paused, not for effect, but because accuracy required it, from being the man standing in a room while someone decided I wasn't worth the staying. Vester nodded. The store held its particular quiet. They sent me someone I didn't know how to account for, Ezra said. I don't know what Mrs. Boone thought she was sending. I don't know what Mabel thought she was going to. He looked at the invoice in his hand, which had ceased to be an invoice and had become a place for his eyes while his mind finished the thought. I know what I got. I know what 12 years at Dry Willow Creek looks like from the inside. He set the invoice on the counter. He looked at Vester with the directness of a man who has something accurate to say and sees no reason to decorate it. I asked for the plainest bargain I could think of. I got something I didn't have the sense to ask for. The plain truth is, I've been on the right side of that deal every day since March of '78, and I'm not fool enough to pretend I knew what I was doing. Harlan Duff set the bridle hook back on its nail. He looked at the floor, then at the window, then at the middle distance where a man looks when he is deciding not to show what his face is doing. He said nothing which was correct. Some things said plainly by the person who lived them require no addition from the people who only watched. Outside the feed store, the October light fell across Abilene at the particular angle it fell in Kansas at the end of harvest, long lateral, making everything it touched look both illuminated and temporary, the way things look when the season is turning towards something colder. The 94 acres at Dry Willow Creek were 8 miles south, already beginning the winter preparation that two people had been executing together for 12 years in the systematic, unhurried manner of people who have worked out between themselves who does what and why, and have not found reason to revisit the arrangement. The bookshelf on the east wall held 41 books. The north wall held its chinking. The south pasture rested its east section in the correct sequence. February's last calf, a 3-year-old bull with the best shoulder conformation in the county, worked the pasture his predecessor had worked. Some bargains are made in ignorance of what they contain. The good ones reveal themselves over time in the way that good land reveals itself not in the first season when everything is potential, but in the 10th when you can see what the soil has actually done with what you gave it. Ezra Colt had given Dry Willow Creek 11 years of his hands before he wrote the letter. He gave it 32 more after. What he built in the first 11 was a ranch. What he built in the 32 after was something that does not appear in farm ledgers and cannot be measured in acreage, though it made the acreage possible, made the ledger make sense, made the north walls chinking hold against every winter that came after. He had asked for the plainest thing he could think of. What he received was not plain. What it was true, and true turned out to be rarer, more durable, more worth the building than anything he had thought to write down in a letter by lamplight in March of 1878, in a cabin that had a drafting north wall and a man inside it who did not yet know what he was missing because he had not yet learned what missing something felt like when the something arrived.